On my wedding day, my wicked mother-in-law humiliated me in front of everyone. You're just the landscaper's daughter, she sneered. My son could have had anyone at his level, not some struggling nobody like you who doesn't belong in our world. But what she never imagined was what would happen months later. Emma Hartley smoothed the folds of her simple wedding gown, her hands trembling as she stared at her reflection in the mirror of the small church dressing room. The white fabric was soft, but it wasn't silk or designer, it was a dress her mother had sewn with love and dedication. This is enough, she told herself over and over. But deep down, the weight of the difference between her world and Jake Ashford's world crushed her heart. She couldn't help but recall the looks of contempt she'd received from his family over the past few months. Her father, Marcus, a strong man with hands hardened by years of landscaping work, peeked through the doorway. His smile was proud, but his eyes showed worry. You look beautiful, sweetheart, he said, entering slowly so as not to wrinkle his freshly pressed shirt, a bit worn, but clean. Emma gave him a faint smile, grateful for his attempt to reassure her. She knew her dad had done his best to support her, even with his own doubts. But how could she feel secure when Jake's parents, seated among the guests outside, simply didn't accept her? Her love for Jake was undeniable, but the reality they faced felt heavier every day. Thanks, Dad, she replied, squeezing his calloused hand. But I can't stop thinking about what's waiting out there. Marcus sighed, moving closer and placing a hand on her shoulder. The only thing that matters is that you two love each other. Everything else? Well, everything else you'll figure out together. Emma nodded, though she couldn't block out the cutting words that Richard and Victoria Ashford, Jake's parents, had thrown around more than once. She's just the landscaper's daughter, Victoria had said, as if it were a life sentence. He could have anyone, someone on his level, the family's friends whispered. But Jake had never wavered. He always defended her, always chose her. That commitment kept her strong, even as those voices of contempt echoed in her head. The sound of guests settling outside told her the moment was near. Her heart raced as she took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Marcus, sensing his daughter's nervousness, squeezed her hand once more. Jake loves you. That's all that matters today. Emma smiled, tears welling up with emotion, and nodded. She knew it was true, but she couldn't ignore the weight of the stares she'd feel once she walked through those doors. Outside, Jake stood at the altar, trying not to show his own anxiety. He knew what was coming, knew what his parents, especially his father Richard, had planned. Richard had been explicitly clear in private, marry that girl, and you're signing your exit from this family. You'll be disinherited, Jake. There's no turning back. The warning still echoed in his head. Victoria, his mother, more diplomatic but equally calculating, had tried a softer approach. Jake, you can have everything you've ever dreamed of, she'd said gently. But with her? It'll be a hard life. She's not your equal. She doesn't understand our world. Don't let this mistake ruin your future. Jake, however, couldn't be swayed. He loved Emma and knew what they shared was real, far more genuine than any superficial relationship his family would have wanted for him. He knew money and power couldn't replace what he felt for her. Still, the pressure from his family haunted him like a shadow. When the church doors opened and Emma appeared, all those thoughts vanished. Jake saw her, and nothing else mattered. She was his anchor, the reason he was willing to defy everything. Emma walked slowly toward him, tears shimmering in her eyes, reflecting the emotions they both shared. In the front row, Richard looked at his son coldly. Victoria, with an expression of resignation, held her head high, but her disdain for the bride was obvious to everyone around. Emma felt her steps were heavy, but when her eyes met Jake's, something inside her calmed. There he was, her sanctuary, her love. The connection between them was so strong she could almost forget the people watching her with judgment disguised as polite smiles. When she reached the altar, Jake took her hands, squeezing them gently. "We're in this together, Emma," he whispered. She nodded, barely containing her tears, knowing what came next wouldn't be easy. The pastor began the ceremony, but before he reached the vows, Richard stood up from his seat. Murmurs rippled through the guests. Jake frowned, knowing his father wouldn't pass up the opportunity to make his final statement. "Excuse me, Pastor," Richard interrupted, his voice cutting through the room. "But I feel it's my duty to ensure everyone here understands what's happening today." The confused pastor paused, looking at Jake for guidance. But Richard didn't wait for a response. He addressed the guests, his voice clear and authoritative. "Today, my son Jake is marrying Emma, the landscaper's daughter. I'm not here to insult anyone, but to make clear what this means for our family." The whispers grew louder, glances darting toward Emma, some sympathetic, others judgmental. "Jake has decided to ignore everything we've done for him, everything we've built together as a family, to marry a woman who is clearly not on his level." Emma felt the air leave her lungs, but before she could react, Jake let go of her hands and stepped forward. "That's enough, Dad," Jake said, his voice firm and laced with controlled anger. Richard seemed unmoved. He looked at his son with a coldness only those closest to him knew. "I'm sorry, son, but if you choose to go through with this, you'll be relinquishing your inheritance, your place in the family, everything. There's no going back." The room fell silent. Guests held their breath, waiting for Jake's response. Everyone knew this moment would change everything. Jake stood motionless before his father, feeling the weight of his words crush down on him. The room, which had been full of whispers and glances, now felt like an unfathomable void where only Richard's words resonated. "You'll relinquish everything." Emma, beside him, watched with her heart in her throat, eyes shining with uncertainty, waiting for him to look at her, to reassure her somehow. But in that moment, all Jake felt was a mix of rage and pain. Richard, still standing, observed his son with a cold, calculating gaze, as if reminding him who held the power in that room. But what he didn't understand was that Jake had already made his decision long before this day. "Dad," Jake finally said, his voice low but steady. "I know what this means to you. I know what you expected from me, what you always wanted me to do. But this is my life, and I'm choosing Emma because I love her. Because I know that with her, I can be happy." Richard frowned as if those words held no value. "Love, you say?" His voice dripped with scorn. "Jake, love doesn't fill bank accounts. It doesn't open doors. It doesn't give you the respect you need to keep building an empire. Do you really think that with her by your side, you can have the future we've prepared for you?" Victoria, Jake's mother, remained seated, watching the scene with resignation, though a flicker of sadness crossed her face. She knew there was no turning back, and while she wanted her son to make a decision that benefited the family, she couldn't help but feel the pain this was causing. "Richard, please," Victoria whispered, trying to soften the atmosphere. "This isn't the time." But Richard didn't listen. He was determined that his son understand the price of his decision. Jake, clenching his jaw, looked his father directly in the eyes. The silence was deafening. Every person present held their breath, aware that what was happening wasn't just a family conflict, it was a silent war for Jake's soul. "I don't need your money or your respect to be happy," Jake continued, his voice growing firmer. "I've realized that what you're offering me is a gilded cage." He turned toward Emma, taking her hand gently. She offers me freedom. She's all I need to feel complete. Hearing those words, Emma felt tears threaten to fall. Jake had always been her rock, but in that moment, as he faced his own father for her, she understood the true scope of the sacrifice he was making. The love he professed wasn't superficial or fleeting. It was a promise of a life, a future together, even if circumstances were against them. Richard clenched his fists, clearly frustrated by his son's lack of obedience. Since Jake was a boy, he'd envisioned a glorious future for him, full of success and power, controlling the family company, taking the name to new heights. But now all that effort seemed to be crumbling before his eyes because of a woman who, according to him, had nothing to offer. "You're making the mistake of your life," Richard spat, looking at Jake as if observing a stranger. "This woman will lead you to ruin, and when that happens, don't expect us to lend you a hand." The cruelty of those words made Emma lower her head. But Jake didn't let himself be affected. He squeezed Emma's hand tighter, determined not to let his father break the love they'd built with so much effort. "Then I won't have to come back," Jake replied with serenity, though his heart pounded fiercely. "If living with her means losing everything else, then I accept it." Richard shook his head slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He took a step back, clearly defeated in his attempt to control the situation. The room remained silent, but this time not from tension between father and son, rather from the guests' astonishment at what they'd just witnessed. It was rare to see someone like Jake so openly defy his powerful family. Finally, Victoria stood up. She walked toward her son, eyes full of contradictory emotions. She'd hoped things wouldn't reach this point, but there was nothing more she could do. She stopped in front of him, glancing briefly at Emma before turning back to her son. "Jake," she said softly, with contained sadness. "You know what this means for your future, don't you? You know we can't continue if you choose this path." Jake looked at her, knowing those words came from a mother who loved him but was also trapped in a world of unbreakable expectations and rules. "Yes, Mom," he replied in a softer tone. "But this is the future I want. Emma is my family now." Victoria nodded, saying nothing more. She knew her son had already made his decision, and as much as it pained her, she wouldn't fight anymore. She gave a sad look to her husband, who had already returned to his seat, defeated. When Victoria returned to her seat, the ceremony continued, though the atmosphere remained charged with strange, tense energy. Jake and Emma exchanged vows, both aware their path together wouldn't be easy. But as they held hands and looked into each other's eyes, they knew what they'd shared, what they'd sacrificed, was worth more than any fortune or inheritance. "I love you," Jake whispered as he placed the ring on her finger, his words filled with a promise for the future. Emma, eyes full of tears, responded with a warm smile, one that made her feel that despite everything, they were in the right place. The ceremony ended amid timid applause and murmurs. Guests knew what they'd just witnessed was more than a wedding, it was an act of rebellion, a declaration of love that defied power and money. As Jake and Emma walked toward the exit together, hand in hand, they knew that although the road ahead might be filled with difficulties, they'd already won the most important battle, choosing their own destiny regardless of the cost. Crossing the church threshold, they realized that together, they could face anything. The first few months after the wedding felt like a dream for Jake and Emma. Despite everything they'd left behind, they had each other, and at first, that seemed enough. The small apartment they rented in a modest neighborhood felt warm, filled with love and hope. Emma decorated it simply but with personal touches that made every corner radiate her essence. Jake, meanwhile, worked tirelessly, seeking new opportunities to build their life together, away from his family's shadows. However, that peace was fleeting. The first signs came when Jake began noticing that doors that used to open easily were now closing in his face. Companies he'd worked with before no longer took his calls. Meetings that had been automatic were now impossible to secure. At first, he thought it was coincidence, perhaps just natural adjustment to having given up his family support. But he soon realized something more sinister was at play. One afternoon, after another failed meeting, Jake sat alone in a coffee shop, staring at his reflection in the window. He felt defeated, as if the weight of his decision to defy his father was finally taking its toll. Then his phone rang. It was Trevor, an old family friend who'd also worked at his father's company. Trevor's tone was solemn, almost compassionate. "Jake, I wanted to call so you'd hear it from me, not someone else," Trevor said, voice low. "Your father's been talking to everyone. He's made sure no partner, no reputable company will offer you work. He's made it clear that anyone who supports you or Emma will be facing him." Jake felt his stomach sink. He knew his father was powerful, but he never imagined he'd go this far. Is he doing this out of revenge? Jake asked, though deep down he already knew the answer. Trevor paused, as if unsure what to say. "It's not just revenge. He wants you back, but on his terms. He says everything can be fixed if you leave Emma and return to the family." Jake clenched his fist on the table, feeling impotent rage rise in his throat. He knew his father saw everything as a power play, another strategy to control him. But this wasn't a business deal. This was his life, his marriage, his love for Emma. "That's not going to happen, Trevor." "I won't leave Emma," Jake replied, voice trembling with contained anger. "It doesn't matter what he does." "I know, but be careful, Jake," Trevor said in a graver tone. "He's determined to destroy any opportunity you have, and I think this is just the beginning." Jake hung up, feeling like the ground had been ripped from under him. He knew facing his father would have consequences, but he never imagined they'd go this far. Jake, a man accustomed to forging his own destiny, realized he was trapped in a web he couldn't control. His father had the power to erase his reputation in the business world, and that was starting to destroy his chances of supporting his home. When he arrived home that night, Emma was waiting for him, as always, with a warm, concerned smile. But tonight, Emma's smile wasn't enough to lift Jake's spirits. He sat on the couch without a word, shoulders slumped, gaze lost. "What happened, Jake?" Emma asked softly, sitting beside him. Jake looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, didn't know what to say. He knew she already felt the tension, that money was starting to run low and opportunities were disappearing. But telling her it was all part of his father's plan made him feel even more helpless. "My father's made sure I can't work anywhere he has influence," he finally said, voice flat. Emma looked at him silently for a moment, processing what that meant. She knew Richard was capable of many things, but it was still difficult to accept someone could do something so cruel, even to his own son. "And what does he want?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. "He wants me to leave you. Wants me to go back and do things his way, like always." Jake let out a bitter sigh. "He says if I leave you, he'll give me everything back. That I can have the life he always wanted for me." Emma felt a knot in her stomach. It wasn't the first time she'd wondered if their love was destroying Jake's life. She knew he'd lost everything to be with her, and though she'd never said it, she feared that at some point, that burden would be too much. But when their eyes met, she saw the same determination in Jake's eyes that had won her over from the beginning. "Jake, I can't ask you to keep losing everything for me," Emma said, voice barely a whisper. Jake looked at her, astonished she'd even think that. He took her hand firmly, as if fearing his father's words could tear her away. "You're not asking me. I chose this. I chose you, and I'd do it 1,000 times again." His voice cracked, but his gaze was steady. "I won't let him win. I won't leave you, Emma." Emma felt tears streaming down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the love and strength Jake was showing in that moment. But they both knew the path ahead was uncertain, and Richard's shadow wouldn't stop pursuing them. The following weeks were even harder. Money began running out, and with every door that closed, Jake felt more helpless. He looked for work wherever he could, but rumors had already spread: Jake, the rebellious son, is blacklisted. Even in places where his family had no direct influence, his name had become synonymous with trouble. Emma tried contributing what she could, but her skills and connections weren't enough to keep them afloat. One day, while Jake sat in their small kitchen reviewing the few remaining work options, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Trevor. It was his father. "You know this doesn't have to be this way, Jake," Richard said, voice smooth but full of that cold authority he'd always wielded. "Everything can go back to how it was. You just have to make the right decision." Jake gripped the phone, rage boiling inside him, but he tried staying calm. "The right decision according to you, Dad. Not according to what I feel. I'm not leaving Emma." Richard paused, as if evaluating the situation. "Very well. Then we'll continue this game. We'll see how much longer you can last with nothing. When you run out of options, you know where to find me." Jake hung up, feeling more defeated than ever. He knew his father wouldn't back down, but neither would he. However, the weight of the situation was beginning to crush him. Emma walked into the kitchen at that moment, seeing the look on Jake's face. "It was your father, wasn't it?" she asked, voice mixed with worry and resignation. Jake nodded, unable to speak. He stood, hugging her tightly. Emma nestled into his chest, and in that moment, they both understood what was at stake wasn't just their love, but their ability to resist an implacable power seeking to separate them. But as Jake gently stroked Emma's hair, he realized something: his father could take everything from him, except the most important thing. Time kept passing, and difficulties seemed to multiply for Jake and Emma. Money was scarcer than ever, and work opportunities for Jake were vanishing at a relentless pace. But amid that storm, news arrived that would change their lives forever. One afternoon, while Jake was out job hunting, Emma sat in their small bathroom holding a pregnancy test in her hands. Her heart pounded fiercely. The result was clear: she was pregnant. Mixed feelings swirled inside her: on one hand, immense joy at knowing she'd be a mother, but on the other, fear of what that would mean amid the difficulties they already faced. When Jake arrived home, exhausted, face pale from another unsuccessful day, he found Emma sitting on the couch with tears in her eyes. But this time, they weren't tears of sadness. Unsure what was happening, Jake quickly approached, worried. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, kneeling before her. Emma took his hands and gave him a small, tearful smile. "I'm pregnant, Jake." For a moment, Jake's world seemed to stop. His mind tried processing what he'd just heard. A child. A baby. Despite all the chaos surrounding their lives, that news filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Slowly, a smile spread across his face, and tears began filling his eyes too. "Really?" he asked, voice broken with emotion. "We're going to be parents?" Emma nodded, and in that moment, Jake hugged her tightly, both letting tears of joy fall freely. For the first time in months, there was a ray of hope amid so much darkness. A child, that tiny being they hadn't even met yet, already gave them a new reason to fight. However, reality soon set in. With the baby's arrival, their needs would multiply, and they knew they had to find a way forward, and fast. That's when Emma remembered one of the few talents she'd always enjoyed: baking specialty cakes and desserts. Emma had learned to bake since childhood, working alongside her mother in their modest home kitchen. It was something that made her happy and had surprised those who'd tried her treats more than once. At that moment, she thought maybe this skill could be the answer they were looking for. "Jake," she said one night during dinner, "I've been thinking I could start selling cakes. I know it's not much, but if we sell them online, maybe we can earn some money." He looked at her with interest. He knew Emma's cakes were incredible, but it hadn't occurred to him they could sell them as income. "You think so?" he asked, already imagining the idea's potential. "I could help with deliveries, and we can create a page to promote them." Emma nodded enthusiastically, pleased he agreed. That night, they stayed up late designing a plan. Jake, with his basic tech skills, created a simple social media page where they could post photos of the cakes Emma would begin preparing. For her part, she began experimenting with new recipes and decorations, wanting to offer something special. The first few weeks were slow. They sold a couple cakes here and there, delivering them to local customers who found their page. Jake handled deliveries by bicycle since they couldn't afford a car. At first it wasn't much, but every time he returned from a delivery, he brought a smile. "People love your cakes," Jake would say excitedly. "Today someone told me they're the best they've ever tasted." Emma, despite pregnancy fatigue and long kitchen hours, felt they were finally finding a way forward. With every order, her confidence grew. The small apartment kitchen had become a makeshift bakery workshop, flour and sugar scattered everywhere, sweet cake aromas permeating every corner. One day, while Jake was making a delivery to a regular customer, a man in a suit waiting at a large building entrance caught his attention. The man, who seemed to be observing the cake box Jake held with interest, approached curiously. "Are those your cakes?" the man asked with a friendly smile. "They're my wife's," Jake replied with equal friendliness. "I just handle deliveries." The man nodded, examining the box carefully. "I work for a coffee shop chain," he said, introducing himself as David, a manager for a major regional food company. "We're looking for something different to offer in our locations. Your cakes have great presentation. Would you mind if we sampled them at our main cafe? If we like them, we could make a deal for regular supply." Jake was speechless for a moment. This was a real opportunity. After everything they'd been through, could this be the turning point they desperately needed? "Of course," he finally replied, feeling adrenaline surge. "I can bring a bigger sample next week." When Jake arrived home that afternoon, he could barely contain his excitement. "Emma, you won't believe what happened," he said, rushing into the apartment. "A manager for a coffee chain wants to sample your cakes. It could be a huge opportunity." Emma looked at him, surprised, eyes wide. "Really?" she asked, as if unable to believe it. Jake nodded, hugging her tightly. "We're going to do it, Emma. This could be what we've been waiting for." That night, as Jake and Emma embraced in the small bed they shared, they felt more optimistic than they had in months. They knew the road would still be difficult, but now there was a possibility, a spark of hope that wasn't there before. And above all, they were doing it together. The following week, Emma prepared her best desserts, and Jake ensured delivery was impeccable. They took them to the chain's main cafe, and David was impressed by both product quality and the story behind them. A couple days later, they received the call that would change their lives. "We love your cakes," David said. "We want to enter a contract for weekly supply." Jake and Emma couldn't believe it. For the first time after so much struggle and sacrifice, there was a real opportunity to move forward. They were starting to build something of their own, something no one, not even Richard, could take away. As Emma caressed her now more noticeable belly and Jake watched her with a smile full of love and pride, they knew that despite all difficulties, they'd won the most important battle, choosing to stay together and face everything life threw at them. And now, with hope for a better future for themselves and their child, they looked ahead with renewed determination. The months following the coffee chain contract brought significant change to Jake and Emma's lives. Little by little, orders increased, and what began as a small survival venture grew into a booming business. Emma, with her increasingly prominent belly, spent long hours in the kitchen creating new recipes and ensuring every cake was perfect. Meanwhile, Jake, always ready, handled deliveries, logistics, and began managing accounts and contracts arriving thanks to the dessert's growing popularity. However, success didn't come without challenges. The work was becoming exhausting for Emma, and the pregnancy in its final trimester left her depleted. As days advanced, one afternoon while bent over the counter decorating a cake for a new delivery, she felt sharp pain in her back that forced her to stop. She took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but the pain didn't subside. Jake walked in at that moment with a large box of supplies and, seeing Emma's expression, immediately dropped everything. "Are you okay?" he asked, rushing to her. Emma tried smiling to reassure him, but the pain wouldn't let her pretend. I think it's just the baby. He's restless today," she replied, though discomfort was evident. Jake looked at her with concern. He knew that even though Emma was incredibly strong, he couldn't ignore her body needed rest. He knelt beside her, taking her hand gently. "Emma, you really should rest. You've been working too hard," he said tenderly but firmly. She shook her head softly. "We have so many orders, Jake. We can't stop now. This is what's pulling us through." Jake stroked her cheek, his face reflecting the mix of love and worry he felt. "I know, but your health and the baby's health are more important than any cake. Let me handle the rest today. Please rest." Emma finally nodded, realizing she couldn't keep ignoring her body's signals. Jake guided her to the couch and helped her sit comfortably. Then he returned to the kitchen, determined to finish the order himself. That night, while Emma rested, Jake reviewed finances and upcoming orders. The business was growing faster than anticipated, and while that was cause for joy, it also meant they needed to manage workload. Hiring help would be sensible, but they were still recovering financially and couldn't afford large expenses. The next morning during breakfast, Emma took her teacup and looked at Jake thoughtfully. "I've been thinking," she said. "Maybe we should look for a small storefront." "A storefront?" he asked, looking up from the newspaper. "Don't you think that's too soon?" Emma smiled, eyes shining with enthusiasm. "It's not too soon if we keep growing at this rate. We'll need more space. Plus, if we have our own place, we could hire someone to help me in the kitchen. We can't keep working solely from the apartment when the baby arrives." Jake remained thoughtful for a moment. The idea of having their own storefront had always been a dream, but recent circumstances had kept him focused only on survival. However, hearing Emma speak with such hope, he knew that dream was closer than they thought. "You're right," he finally said with a smile. "Let's start looking. It won't be easy, but if we find the right place, we can take the next step." Emma returned his smile, feeling immense relief. Although the path had been difficult, now there was a new horizon full of possibilities. The following weeks were filled with excitement and nervousness. Jake handled deliveries and continued scouting potential locations, while Emma, despite advanced pregnancy, kept managing orders from home with occasional help from a neighbor. Finally, one day after weeks of searching, they found a small storefront downtown, right next to a popular cafe. It was modest but had everything they needed: a spacious kitchen, a customer service area, and a display window that could attract passers-by. The rent was fair, and with effort, they knew they could turn it into something special. "This is the place," Emma said excitedly, touring the space, already imagining how she'd decorate it and how it would look filled with fresh cakes. "I can see it all, Jake. It'll be our home away from home." Jake watched her, feeling a mix of pride and love. Despite everything they'd been through, they were building something of their own, something no one could take away. "We'll make it happen," Jake promised, taking her hand. "This will be our next step." With the contract signed and keys in hand, renovations began. It was a slow process as they still managed orders while simultaneously preparing the space for opening. But with each passing day, the place transformed, and with it, their lives. One afternoon while painting the new shop's walls, Emma paused, hand on her stomach. "I think the baby's excited too," she said with a smile. "He's moving around a lot today." Jake quickly approached, placing his hand on Emma's belly, feeling small movements. "He's going to be a great baker. I can already tell," he joked, eyes full of love. Emma laughed, but her laughter was interrupted by a small wave of pain. Jake looked at her, worried. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though pain was evident. "I think it's just the baby settling, but maybe we should head home and rest." Jake didn't hesitate. He knew the last few weeks had been exhausting for both, but especially for Emma. They left the tools and returned home, knowing that while there was much to do, Emma's and the baby's health were most important. The business was on its way, plans were moving forward, and the future was beginning to take shape. Every day, despite challenges, Emma and Jake felt closer to achieving their dreams. They knew the road hadn't been easy, but they also knew they'd walked it together, and that made them invincible. And even though problems and past shadows were still present, the success they were building with their own hands was the best testament that love and perseverance could overcome even the highest barriers. Jake and Emma had been working tirelessly to finish the new shop's details. Opening day was fast approaching, and although both were exhausted from long work days, there was a mixture of excitement and nervousness in the air. The dream of having their own business was about to become reality. But the pressure for everything to go well was starting to weigh on them, especially with the baby so close to arriving. One morning, as Emma finished organizing the display cases in the new space, she felt sharp pain in her abdomen. At first she thought it was just another pregnancy discomfort, but this time the pain was stronger, and unease flooded her. She stopped, breathing deeply and leaning on the counter, waiting for the pain to pass. Jake, who was outside reviewing paperwork, walked in at that moment and saw her leaning over, face tight with pain. "Emma," he asked worriedly, quickly approaching. "What's wrong?" She tried smiling to reassure him, but pain wouldn't let her pretend. I think the baby's ready to come," she said, voice trembling. Jake felt fear and excitement flood him simultaneously. He knew the moment was near but didn't expect it so soon. "We need to get to the hospital," he said urgently, grabbing keys and carefully helping Emma stand. The trip to the hospital was a mix of tension and excitement. Emma breathed slowly, trying to stay calm while Jake drove with one hand on the wheel, the other holding hers. Every so often he glanced at her, making sure she was okay, though latent fear in his chest made him feel helpless. Upon arriving at the hospital, they were quickly received by staff, and Emma was taken to the delivery room. Jake, though anxious, stayed by her side the entire time. The hours that followed were long and exhausting. Jake had never felt such an intense combination of fear and emotion. As he held Emma's hand, he saw the effort and pain on her face, but also the incredible strength she demonstrated in that moment. His admiration for his wife grew with every second. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours, a baby's cry broke the tense silence of the room. Jake and Emma looked at each other with eyes full of tears, happiness and relief. The doctor lifted the baby, and as she was placed on Emma's chest, the room filled with a peace they hadn't felt in months. "It's a girl," Jake whispered, voice broken with emotion. Emma, exhausted but radiant, looked at her daughter tenderly. She stroked the baby's soft skin, whispering words of love as tears rolled down her cheeks. Jake leaned in, embracing them both, and for a moment the entire outside world disappeared. They were a family. Hours later, when Emma rested with the baby in her arms, Jake left the room to get some air. Despite the joy he felt, he knew work still awaited. The shop was almost ready for grand opening, but there were still details to sort out. As he looked out the hospital window, he thought of his father, of everything he'd left behind, and how destiny had led them to this moment. The fight with his family, the closed doors, the daily struggles, it had all been worth it to get where they were now. However, his father's shadow remained, though distant. He knew Richard had tried everything to make their lives miserable. But what he hadn't been able to foresee was that the love he shared with Emma was much stronger than any influence or power his father could wield. But doubt lingered, was he truly free from his family? A few days after their daughter's birth, whom they named Lily, meaning purity and new beginnings, the shop's grand opening finally arrived. Emma, still recovering, managed last.